What I know that keeps coming back in conversations is this issue of social value and embedding social value. And I think once we get to a point where maybe policies are more demanding of social value and agendas are being set to deliver on social value more, then we'll likely get to a point where more developers are seeking ways to create developments that are more socially embedded.
There's something that is lost, even if you have encouraging them to grow through policy, you can still lose the connection with the actual residents. Control and security are what a lot of the kind of inquiries we get, that's what people are looking for, and they don't necessarily want to have to go through a long and complicated development process to get there.
This is the Property Development Book Club podcast. Please be advised that the views expressed are of the individuals and do not represent their employers and should not be taken as advice. Please do your own research and seek advice from an appointed professional.
Hi, I'm Hanna Afolabi. I'm founder and director of Black Women in Real Estate. I'm also founder and director of Mood and Space, a development consultancy focused on socially led housing. Today, we're talking about community-led housing and its solution to affordable housing. And I'm joined by Lev and Selasi. So Lev is the director of Community-Led Housing London. He has previously worked at the GLA and is an architect and has a degree in real estate. Today, he'll be talking a little bit more about his initiatives. Lev, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
So yeah, I lead the team at Community-Led Housing London. It's actually part of a small housing association called CDS Cooperatives, who've got a history in supporting community-led housing. And we really exist to support start-up community groups or existing community groups in providing their own homes together. And we also kind of provide advice to councils and housing associations and developers as well in terms of how you might create community-led housing.
Great, thank you, Lev. And Selasi?
I'm an architect, but I'm also co-founder of an organisation called Black Females in Architecture. And we are a social enterprise as well as a membership organisation for Black women in the built environment industry. I am also currently working as a principal project officer at the GLA's regeneration, within the GLA's regeneration directorate.
Thank you both. I'm so excited for you to be here. This is slightly a niche topic, but I really wanted us to talk about it to allow people to understand more about what community-led housing is, the art of the possible, and actually how it could start to solve some of the affordable issues that we have, especially here in London. So the first question is, for everyone's benefit, what is community-led housing and what are community land trusts?
So I'll start. I think it's an umbrella term. It includes things like community land trusts, which are probably the most well-known at the moment, but housing cooperatives who have been around for a long time and probably more existing housing stock in London, and co-housing as well. I guess what they have in common is they're all sort of non-profit organisations that are democratically run by their members or have a large degree of kind of resident input in how they're run. So co-ops in particular are what are called fully mutual organisations, where the residents control the organisation kind of completely. Only residents can be members and only members can be residents. With community land trusts, I kind of call them semi-mutual in that people from the wider community can also be members and kind of run the organisation together with residents. I guess those are the kind of unique things compared to most other affordable housing. So housing associations typically don't have any resident input in how they're governed and how they're run.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Selasi, do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, Lev is like the expert on this stuff. So yeah, I think we can expand on like other things. Yeah, but I think as a catch-all in terms of definition, what people I guess, don't know about community-led housing. I think they've covered it.
And so then how do we, when we're thinking about community-led housing, I know you said semi-mutual and mutual, how do they maintain their affordability compared to other types of residential products?
Yeah, so there's a couple of mechanisms, and I think that's probably one of the things they're really good at.
Yeah.
So co-ops, for example, typically provide rented housing. I mean, community-led housing can provide a whole range of tenures, perhaps it's worth saying. It can be all kinds of affordable, from rented to low-cost ownership to even occasionally market sale. But I think what brings them all in common is protecting those benefits in perpetuity. Yeah. So co-ops are actually, fully mutual housing co-ops are exempt from the right to buy if they're social housing. Community land trusts have a similar thing, where if they lease to a registered provider, those homes are also exempt from the right to acquire. Then in low-cost ownership terms, a lot of community land trusts have come up with covenants around how homes are resold. So if you've bought something at a discount, you can only sell it on at a discount. How that discount is calculated, people have kind of innovated around. So sometimes it's linked to a percentage of the market value in perpetuity, but actually possibly more radically, it could be that the resale price is calculated in relation to local incomes or relation to CPI or some other form of inflation, so it doesn't track the kind of speculative property market. So I think all of them take housing and property, land assets, out of the speculative property market and sort of protect them in some kind of vehicle, in some kind of organisation. I suppose one final sort of a lot of the time they try to put lots of belts and braces onto these things. So the organisations typically have a form of asset lock. So if the organisation, for whatever reason, dissolves or winds up, then its assets can only go to similar organisations with similar objectives. So that objective, that aim, isn't lost.
Yeah. Okay. And so, and this is slightly a left question on that basis. What is the biggest misconception around community-led housing?
Some people think it's very difficult to make happen. And then some people also don't necessarily appreciate this thing of affordability and the different levers of affordability that are intertwined into it. I think it's sometimes misunderstood as, oh, it's just affordable, but actually it's a lot more complex than that, because the property market, construction market, architectural market is just very complex as it is. So I think that's where some confusion and misconceptions come in around affordability, around the motivation behind wanting to seek something that's affordable in perpetuity, and what needs to go in to be able to facilitate that. And then, yeah.
I think so. I mean, it's interesting you pick that one as a misconception, that it's really difficult to do, because in some ways it is really difficult to do. But that's also because of the way we tend to think about it, or the way the wider sector thinks about it, which is that it has to be a group of people from the community with no professional backgrounds coming together spontaneously to take on a large development project, which, as we all know, is quite a complex and risky thing to do, and try to do that, as a startup with no track record, limited access to borrowing, no money usually. So if we think about it in those terms, it is actually quite difficult to do. But there's nothing that says community-led housing has to be directly developed by a community organisation. And I think the things I was emphasising, it's more about how they're run and giving democratic control to residents in how the housing is run, and also what matters most to them as residents. So there's nothing that says they need to be like super expert in every aspect of the development process. And actually they can partner with professional developers, housing associations, councils who could do the development element, and similarly, you were talking about the affordability. I think there's sometimes there's a misconception amongst members of the community who are interested in doing community-led housing, that's somehow magically going to be affordable. And I think we know, that doesn't happen. Affordability's got to come from somewhere, either grant or subsidy or something. And again, that's what I was emphasising earlier. It's about locking in that affordability once you've achieved it. But actually, in making it affordable in the first place, it's difficult and possibly harder than, say, a large housing association with lots of stock, lots of unleveraged, debts paid off, rental income streams. They can borrow at very good rates that a startup organisation really can't. So,
Yeah, and I think the point on affordability is really interesting, because I think it's not the kind of the standard definition or planning definition of affordable that we're talking about, which I think should be quite clear. It's not always a social rented product or always an affordable rented product. It is something that is affordable for the community in which it's supposed to be serving, which I think sometimes falls out of our planning definition.
It can be the standard tenures.
It can be,
A lot of housing co-ops are social rent,
Yeah.
and a number of community land trusts have even got all sorts of tenures. But I think one of the reasons why it usually isn't that is because the motivations to do something different is because it's not available in the kind of conventional setup. So a number of community-led housing organisations have innovated on, how do we define affordability? What does affordable mean? And is it some sort of percentage of the market, or is it linked to local incomes? Is it linked to my income? Is it linked to, I don't know. And it's not just innovating in affordability. Some groups prioritise that. For some, it's much more on how it's managed and maintained, and do I have control over that? So there's tenant management organisations which have been around for a long time, or it might be who the residents are. Sometimes that also creates kind of conflict. There's good reasons why a community, and that might be, when we say community, it could be a geographic community or a demographic community, and how they see the need and how they offer homes for that need, or maybe need isn't even the right word, but kind of aspiration that those members of the community might have. So that often is kind of slightly at odds with conventional ways of thinking, I think.
Yeah. And then I think the other point that was discussed was the difficulty. I agree with both of you, because I don't think community land trusts are significantly more difficult than any type of development. All development is hard, right? I think the misconception might be that it's going to be easier because it's potentially smaller, which everyone knows it takes the same amount of effort to do an 11-unit scheme as it does a 1,000-unit scheme. It's a slog. And then I guess the other thing is that, like you said, the experience, the community coming together, maybe the misconception is that they don't know how to access professionals who can actually support them, which maybe is incorrect. But Levi, you touched on something that's really interesting, and maybe Selasi, I'll go to you on this. How do you think that the CLTs can empower communities?
I think for me, I see it as probably the core thing that community-led housing can offer is that thing of empowering and emboldening communities to take a more active role in how they are able to attain housing, and in the way that really meets their needs or their aspirations, and coming away from the model of, if they have the means to, not depending on, local authorities or other means to be able to be housed, especially when there's so much pressure there. We're in a situation where we need as much diversity in the supply, in the offer, in order to be able to tackle housing crisis. So for that reason, I think having a sector of the industry that is really about emboldening and empowering people to be able to take matters into their own hands a bit more, I think is very essential, And I think that's where community-led housing is probably the strongest within the diverse range of ways that you can deliver housing.
Yeah, and what do you think about that, Liv?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think it is the key thing is that empowerment and the democratic control. I mean, one example is not to always assume, just touching on your development point, it doesn't always have to be small either. I mean, this might sound small, but one of the projects we're involved in is the St Anne's Hospital site in Tottenham, and that's a GLA-owned site, and Peabody and Hill are the kind of development partners for the GLA, and it's a sort of 900 home plus scheme, but there's a requirement on them to make at least 50 of those homes available to a community-led housing organisation. So with that, the Gida Housing Cooperative we're working with aren't doing any of the development. That's being done by Peabody. Large organisation can kind of cash flow it, etc. But you're looking for the community-led housing organisation, the housing cooperative, to purchase it at the end. So they've got control over the ownership. They've got control over allocations because they're looking at an intermediate rent. And funnily enough, in that case, the challenge is how they become a registered provider, which is another sort of issue when you're a startup. But I think there are always challenges, but there's ways also to kind of address them and think about what matters most for any group of people.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I find it interesting, the registered provider point, because people assume directly that a registered provider is a housing association and it's completely interlinked, whereas private organisations can also be registered providers. Yeah, and non-charitable organisations.
Yeah, there are for-profit RPs now. I don't know so much about that one.
No,
That's a relatively new thing.
I think it's just more the kind of association that not anyone can just rock up and become a provider of affordable rented products that as under the planning definition, including community developments.
I mean, there's nothing that stops anyone becoming a registered provider, but if you
accept the money,
there's a legal requirement that if you receive GLA capital grant, then the landlord of those homes has to be a registered provider of social housing. Yeah. To become a registered provider of social housing, it seems incredibly difficult compared to, when it first came in the 80s and 90s, being, RSLs as they were. I think they felt like they were pretty much saying, "Oh, you look like one, why don't you?" And now they really raised the bar. So a startup organisation, it's a lot of work to demonstrate that they will be a competent landlord and they're not about to go bankrupt and all that kind of stuff.
We need more of that though, because otherwise we end up with poor quality housing offers, and it's the people who are the most vulnerable, who are probably in the most need of more affordable housing, that end up kind of suffering at the hands of people who aren't very interested in.
There's been a kind of a trend, hasn't there, of housing associations kind of merging and becoming bigger and bigger. I mean, when they started off in the 60s, it was also, similar. A lot of people have made that comparison, really, saying, they were doing something for a particular community, and now they've become so large and bigger than councils in some cases that they're not particularly connected to any local place.
That level of care is then lost, and then
and also bigger than a lot of the developers. Like hundreds of thousands of homes under care. And I guess to that point around the comparison to housing associations, especially from when they're initially started out, how do you think community-led housing compares to housing associations, and do you think they can have the same journey in terms of scale?
I mean, there's nothing to stop them. Sorry, It's funny. So the comparison might be somewhere like Switzerland or Germany, where housing cooperatives and their sense of housing cooperatives kind of feel community land trust-esque as well, are the biggest providers of low-cost rented housing. And they do have housing associations, but they're the small specialist niche things. So it's really a kind of a quirk of history that we've got to where we've got to. And also, if you think about a lot of the housing associations in the UK, some of them are still very small. There's a load of small housing associations that have stayed small. Some of them have done the deal that basically took on a load of council housing through stock transfers historically, and that's what's made them kind of get really big, and government legislation that's kind of said, okay, now we're expecting delivery through housing associations, and not expecting, almost limiting, until relatively recently, limiting the ability of councils to provide their own council housing. So, you know, it's been kind of government policy that has allowed them to grow in the way they've grown. So it's not inherent to a particular governance model, if you will. And I think the only real difference is, sometimes I think, I know this is a bit of a crazy idea, but if you had the board of housing associations kind of elected by all their residents, that would kind of be a very large community-led housing organisation. Now you might still lose touch, you know, with that. There are actually a couple of examples, such as the Phoenix community housing in the southern part of Lewisham, which is a kind of resident-owned, resident-controlled housing association. They took stock transfer of Lewisham stock. There's Walterton and Elgin community homes, which is a community land trust in sort of North Westminster. And there was a community campaign, and they got their estate transferred into a resident-owned housing association. So there was a kind of, and there's an ability to do that. There's a couple of other examples as well. So there's nothing that says housing associations are a certain way, or that community-led housing is a certain way.
I'm just thinking that it's back to this thing of the need for diversity. Another thing that comes to mind is just cause and effect, like Lev's explained. Like, it's the history of housing delivery that has brought us to where we are now. It's the policies that have brought us negative and positive, seemingly negative or seemingly positive, that have also contributed to all of this stuff. And I think it's high time that we accept where we are and take stock of where we are, and just put minds together as to how we can move forward in a positive way to address all of the key issues that we have. And I think, why not rethink where our history of housing associations and community-led housing started, where we are now, and how that can be developed into the future, and how that can play an integral part in housing delivery more broadly, and just create more space for councils to work with and facilitate more community-led housing, or local government to make sure that policies are not sidelining and actually opening up the doors for more community-led housing to happen. But I think taking stock of history, I don't know if there's any publication or something that sets all of these things out sort of succinctly, so that people can understand where we've come from and where we are now and where we could possibly go. Because I think part of the issue is people are comfortable with the status quo and the normal way of doing things. So if it's financing, for example, people's hesitancies, or where it starts to become a big issue, is around financing of some types of community-led housing, because what is now the norm is you have a developer who's got some cash, they have some land, and we're going to fund the development, and that's it. Like any other thing, nuance in between, it becomes difficult, but there's nothing to say that it needs to be difficult. But I
think that's a really interesting point in terms of the status quo, but also the fact that like housing associations who are resident-led already, as a body, kind of already fall into the community-led housing. And so almost like, what could we do to encourage financiers, local authority, developers to look at this as actual potential model to deliver more housing for communities who are desperate, who seem desperate because there's so many of them popping up, to have a say in their community and how and where they live? Like what could be done to
I think
shake
it
it
is.
up?
What I know that keeps coming back in conversations is this issue of social value and embedding social value. And I think once we get to a place where maybe policies are more demanding of social value and agendas are being set to deliver on social value more, then we'll likely get to a point where more developers are seeking ways to create developments that are more socially embedded, I guess. And in that, I think that will create loads of opportunity for those sorts of partnerships to happen. Whereas now I think people's motivation for doing development is not necessarily that way inclined, because if I'm a developer, why should I seek out a community to go and pursue a community-led type of development if I don't need to, per se, and I can continue on the status quo?
Yeah. How would you answer that question?
I think there's something about, you were saying about, well, there are small housing associations that are already doing that. There's something that is lost, even if you have, encouraging them to grow through policy, you can still lose the connection with the actual residents. So I think I see it as more like a balance. So it's an interesting question for, say, something like London CLT, which is now growing, that it has multiple projects in different places, but then is it the same thing everywhere, and it's just numbers and scale, just like a large housing association, or is there some sense of local control or local influence over individual projects or individual estates or whatever it might be? So I think there's a similar approach we're looking at the moment, more in the private rented sector, which also has lots of issues, and this kind of comes from, thinking about what is important to, what are the kind of questions that community-led housing might be really good at answering. So achieving affordability in the first place is hard if you don't have track record and so on, but actually control and security are what a lot of the kind of inquiries we get, that's what people are looking for. Yeah. And they don't necessarily want to have to go through a long and complicated development process to get there. Yeah. And if we could look at maybe acquiring either existing properties or newly built properties that happen to be built by someone else, but then having that in a kind of federated way, so that you've got maybe a secondary level, something we're looking at setting up called the Collective Ownership Society, which is a sort of a co-op of co-ops. Yeah. That could make those kind of longer term strategic decisions about financing and growth, and then have the day-to-day control held by small groups of residents working, together amongst themselves, which builds a real sense of community amongst those residents and has these kind of spin-off social value things of like, neighbourliness, mutual support, and whilst allowing growth. So I think one of the issues with the kind of smaller organisations that are resident-led, once they are housed, if they own the property, they don't tend to think about growth in the same way, because their primary motivation is kind of, well, I live here, and sometimes they recognise there's a wider issue, but taking on another development project or taking on more growth is hard for them, and it feels risky, and it feels like we're putting our own homes on the line. Whereas if that's done at a slightly secondary level and in a kind of managed way, we think that's how you can achieve both scale and growth in terms of accessing better lending terms or whatever it might be, but keeping the kind of day-to-day control at the resident level, at the kind of level of the individual community.
Yeah. And you mentioned another initiative you're working on.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in some ways it overlaps, because you could also say, okay, what about, I think this one comes more from the assumption that community groups are sort of spontaneously spring up and decide to come together and take on a massive development project, which they do sometimes. But if we really want to scale that, maybe we could think about starting from the other side. So rather than group first, we start sort of project first, and we say, okay, there's already this developer, or there's already a council which has money, it has land, and it's looking to do a scheme. Okay, why can't we assemble a group of people around that project and form them into a community? And we'll have to try a lot more to think, really think about what binds them and how they make decisions and how they kind of fit together as a community. But they could input into a scheme, although because you've selected them for a particular scheme, what the unit size mix is, what the tenure mix is. So you're kind of finding people that kind of fit what the professional sector is already doing, and then that's how you achieve. And then at the end of the development process, they can either take ownership of the freehold or take on some sort of maintenance arrangement as a sort of resident management company or something like that. And it's that long-term kind of discussing and meeting about your homes that kind of perpetuates a sense of community. So and that's been interesting for us as a kind of a team, because we started off with that preconception that was almost kind of slightly given to us and was there in the environment, that the kind of advice and mentoring we would give was on development support. Like, so we had surveyors and planners and legal expertise, etc., is what groups needed. Whereas now we're sort of saying, well, actually, a lot of that stuff can be managed by a professional housing association, council, private developer, whoever. But actually, the kind of support is on the group building side of it. It's how do you make inclusive decisions, and how do people feel about their role within a community, all those kinds of things. And how do they, influence and make decisions over things that perhaps aren't the make or break things financially. So it's not the big things about scale, massing, units, tenures, but it's the bits you might touch. It's the entrance sequence. It's kind of like maybe more architectural things, or how things are managed and run, and what decisions does that community want about its ground floor lobby space. How do they want to use it? Is there some sort of garden space that they can all share, and how do they make decisions of how that's run? Actually, is an interesting one. One of the projects that I think kind of comes the closest to that is the House for Artists in Barking. So strangely, it's been talked about as artists, but if you sort of put the artist thing to one side, it could apply to anyone. And it could be, it doesn't even have to be a demographic group. It could just be a group of people who need intermediate rented housing, and you select them earlier in the process. You allow them to influence the scheme, and I'm not sure how much. Well, the House for Artists kind of gets there because they have some control over the ground floor space. But if that was kind of expanded to the whole building and the housing as well, you can imagine that decision making between neighbours being the vehicle for a sense of community to be kind of continued in the long term, and how that kind of community gets together, makes decisions, and possibly it's some of it's like the really boring decisions about like how do we deal with the bins or the whatever, but actually it's the stuff that happens outside of the boring meetings that makes people get to know their neighbours, or so they can speak to them, and I think that's where the social value is in a way. The control over like deciding on bins and stuff is a bit questionable, but yeah.
But it's still part of your lived journey. And I think the thing that I love about community-led housing specifically is the fact that you have ownership over the way, to some extent, you have ownership over the way and how you live. And I know you mentioned like London CLT, and I've previously been on the board of E16 CLT, and I think that was where I realised how impactful community-led housing could actually be. You know, people who've lived in the area for decades, who are impacted by a large-scale regeneration, can actually take a bit of land and say, this is kind of what we want delivered, this is how we prefer to live. And the onus is then on local authority or policy to enable that to happen, or the developer, and it could potentially step in and say, actually, we see there's real value in keeping local people local, and actually developing and creating spaces that they actually want to live in, as opposed to what we currently have. What you said is like the standard approach to delivery, which doesn't demonstrate diversification of offer at all, and we currently don't have that.
I think it also makes so much assumptions about how people want to live, and doesn't create room for us to be informed as designers, as people who are enabling or creating out the world that we inhabit. It doesn't allow the people actually doing the living to have as much of a say in how that happens. And I think if we fast forward 20, 50 years, it's going to be very problematic. And if our cities aren't informed by how people actually want to live.
Yeah. I mean, what's really funny about that, I always make the observation that when any development does engagement or consultation, it does it with surrounding residents, not necessarily the people who are actually going to live in the homes. And I think that's one of the things about community-led housing is, yes, it impacts surrounding residents as well, but it more impacts those who are living in it, be that in its tenure or its design or its who the neighbours are, how it works as a place. And there's that, as you say, only ever comes in as statistics, like waiting list numbers, or this is what the property market will do in this place. Everyone wants an ensuite or a something, and you're like, well, how do you know that actual resident wants that?
Exactly. Yeah, it's a massive assumption, and like on the premise that you know, like if you think about every other industry where they start with the customer first or the customer experience first, we completely do the absolute opposite. And actually, I think community-led housing is the best way to do consumer, I would quote unquote, consumer-led design, consumer-led development, because we will truly understand the needs of the people who are going to be living there and their input into it from before it's completed to then after, because they're intrinsically a connected community, like you said, Lev. But I guess we probably will be running out of time, so I just want to ask the kind of last wrap-up question, which is, what does a successful community-led development look like? And probably two questions in one. How does someone who is interested, say a socially focused developer or a community in Tottenham, how do they go about starting a community-led group, community-led housing, to develop their own homes?
I think there's two things that we've often spoken about in the past. There's one about the groups and who are the group, who's interested in the thing, what is their understanding of how committed they are to achieving a certain outcome, what is it that connects them together, I guess. So I think one thing is about finding that. If you're starting from a position of, actually, we know that ultimately we want some kind of a built thing or homes for us, but first we need to galvanize some people together, find like-minded people and start to have these conversations, start to do the research, start to reach out to organisations like Community-Led Housing London. That's one aspect of it. And I think on the other hand, it's, where is this thing actually going to happen? And do you need to acquire some land? Do you need to have some existing stock transferred over to you? If that's the case, where is that going to come from? Start engaging the kind of organisations that might have existing assets to transfer. There's a huge issue of underoccupied or unoccupied homes in the UK. Possible place to start. There's huge issues with councils not being able to look after this stock, maybe another place to start. But then there's also landowners, maybe brownfield land or just undeveloped land yet, we'll not go into it now, but there's this whole immersion thing about grey belt. Who knows? So there's so many places, if you're coming from the community to start, or if you're coming from the asset or the land to start, I think you maybe both or either or. I think if you're interested, I think, yeah, definitely those two places are places to start inquiring and forming community and forming understanding and gathering professionals around.
I might answer the first bit, like what in terms of one of the most amazing projects which you haven't mentioned so far, one that's kind of close to my heart because I was involved really early on, even before the community-led housing London was set up, is a project called RUS, which stands for the Rural Urban Synthesis Society in Ladywell. So they recently built 36 homes, which is, you know, not insignificant. And what I really like about it is the whole process. It was founded by some of the children from the 1980s timber frame self-build projects, where they wanted to do kind of a self-build scheme, but they wanted to combine that with affordability and perpetuity, and also that sense of kind of a community. So I think I only took me until I saw it built, I only started to realise what the rural urban synthesis means, and I think it's something to do with, I might be completely wrong by the way, but something to do with, like, you know, the village in the city. So you have a sense of community in the city. So as well as they want to do food growing and all those things. So there's like this environmental stuff. It's, you know, it had very ambitious approaches to, you know, energy, water recycling, all that kind of stuff. And then the social side, like as a community, that they're all involved in one way or another. They selected people really early on, particularly for the ownership homes. So they could customize and self-build their or self-finish their individual flats, and those look unlike any other new build property because, you know, people have made it their own. And then you've got this on the affordability side, a real range of tenures. So they've got 6 affordable rent, London affordable rent, 2 shared flats at intermediate London living rent. They've got a whole range of different shared equity, which is a sort of like a discount market sale. They've got a couple of shared ownerships as well. And they're really trying to create a kind of holistic community, which is 100% affordable, but at different levels. One of the things we were touching on earlier is, you know, how you allocate people into that. So they couldn't, and it seems like a simple thing, allocate the rented homes earlier on in the process, particularly because again, the conventional approach is the council nominates people right at the end, which they did, but they could have focused on people in existing council homes who are maybe under-occupying or maybe a little older and wanted a sense of community, put them into there, and then the home that they free up could be allocated to the person at the top of the waiting list. So there's stuff to work around there, so relatively simple things. And then in terms of where to go, I would say, yeah, any community group looking to think about taking on some sort of community-led housing projects, we're happy to talk to people. I suppose the thing might be that there isn't necessarily a lot of money around at the moment to really get that going. So I think there's been
When you say money, you mean grant? Yeah.
Grant or even the early stage revenue, which can be repaid and is a sort of recyclable loan. So just to get that going, that's all been allocated. So capital grant, yes, there's mechanisms for that, but there's no kind of obvious place for, you know, doing a feasibility study, or maybe we need a lawyer, or even like to incorporate an organisation or anything like that. And there's a bit of a national campaign to sort of write to your MP, let's try and get it back on the agenda of the new government. So that might be something that people can look at. And then I would say any developers that are interested in social value and have schemes, then I think the thing I was mentioning earlier, we're calling it build belonging, where we can help to convene a group around a pre-existing project, or and then do the kind of the training and the support around the group and how they integrate into an existing project.
Yeah, so great. So contact you. Get in touch with Lev. Okay. So thank you both, Lev and Selasi, for coming on and having a conversation with us about community-led housing. It's been really enlightening, and we could have gone on for absolute ages, but we have to stop now. But thank you for listening. If you have any questions, get in touch. But please like, share and subscribe.
Building dreams we can. In the privacy, racing up the road.